Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And I am so excited to have Steve Riegel with me today to talk about what writers get wrong about space. So thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what is it that makes you a trusted source on the topic of space and space travel and some of the physics, all those things we're going to get into today?
Okay. I'm retired from the U.S. Air Force. I spent 20 years active duty in space related operations. Helping to buy satellites, track satellites in orbit, was a missile launch officer, and then spent a lot of years working with the GPS satellites, writing some policy for how the military would use capabilities for the military side without impacting the signals that go worldwide to the civilian users. So 20 years of space related ops, got a lot of stuff there. Uh, got a master's of engineering in space operations from UC Colorado Springs. And I've been an amateur astronomer for about 20 years now. Just observing, as I tell people, I looked at a lot of stuff and wrote it down. Um, but it's just been a hobby for the last 2 decades. Um, that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah, I'm a part-time high school teacher. I teach astronomy and rocketry as electives, and also mentor some competition rocketry teams.
Awesome. And full disclosure for people who are watching out there, Steve and I have taught together for many years, and his love of astronomy and things like that has just been infectious. I'm not somebody who gravitates toward the sciences myself. I'm much more naturally inclined toward humanities, but hearing you talk about space and constellations and even the physics of it makes me really fascinated. So I love your passion, and obviously you have the cred to back that up as well. So what are some of the common misconceptions that you see play out in books, TV shows, movies all the time? Like, I've heard of some, but you actually know what is possible and what isn't. So what are some of the most common misconceptions you see out there?
I think one of the biggest that I've seen, and it makes for really exciting drama in the movies and the TV series, and is completely unrealistic, would be the maneuverability of spacecraft. Look at Star Wars, and they have the dogfighting scenes, X-wings and Tie fighters going everywhere. Um, from a real physics standpoint, without some really impressive improvements in engine technology, truly into the realm of fiction, we just don't have vehicles that can maneuver like that. One of the challenges of our spaceships is we're limited by chemical fuels. And there's only so much fuel we can store. There's only so much energy that that fuel has. And so once we get a spacecraft moving in a certain direction, to change its direction becomes really hard. Um, we get a satellite on orbit, for instance, we can speed it up, we can fire the jets and make it go faster. It'll climb into a higher orbit. We can turn it around, fire the jets backwards, slow it down, it'll drop into a lower orbit. And we can do that pretty easily. In the orbital plane, you can maneuver, change an orbit by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. That's very doable. The problem is you've got something called angular momentum in that orbit. And so once you're in an orbital plane, changing that plane to go crosswise, change your direction, becomes really, really hard. And so, even for instance, the space shuttle, once it got on orbit, if it burned every drop of fuel it had, it would be able to change its plane by a couple of degrees, which is really not much. And certainly, we don't have the ability for these big swooping dogfight type scenes. Um, so that is something where we have to simply suspend the physics of the moment, assume they have a drive that is capable of providing that much change, and then enjoy the show from there. But that's yeah, orbital mechanics is one of the hardest ones, and there are some that do a really good job of getting it right. So, for instance, in The Martian, Andy Weir did a great job.
Well, it's not The Martian, but it's the one Andy
Unsolicited,
Weir book that
promo
I
there.
do own, so I
Um,
brought it for a prop.
yeah, so in The Martian, when he's talking about, okay, we've got the crew, they're on their way back from Mars, and they realize that he's alive, he's got to get rescued, and their only option is to basically go around the Earth and go right on back out. Um, that's actually based on some really solid orbital mechanics. You can't just stop, turn around, go back. We just don't have the fuel capacity to be able to do that. Um, Other movies that get things right, Interstellar, widely acclaimed for their scenes, especially around the black hole and the time dilation effects of being in this enormous gravity field caused by the black hole. They actually hired Kip Thorne, one of the preeminent black hole scientists, to help them get that part of the science correct.
Mm,
So I really appreciate it when the movies and the books take the time to get the basic stuff right. Because when it comes down to it, that's my biggest pet peeve.
mm,
We know that Star Wars is going to have fantasy, but if you can't get the basic physics of things that we know ought to happen in a certain way, if you can't get the basic physics right, it makes it hard to suspend the disbelief and enjoy the rest of the story.
mm. Yeah, speaking of Star Wars, that I didn't actually know that about the TIE fighters. I'm a little heartbroken because I love the space battles, but now that you put it that way, it makes an enormous amount of sense.
Yeah.
Something that I have heard about Star Wars and other movies like it that is incorrect, that I do see with my very limited knowledge of how space works is the explosions, the explosion of the Death Star
Mhm.
and how that all happens. I've heard is incorrect on a few levels as well. So is it possible to have an explosion in space, or if so, what would it look like? Can you talk about that?
You absolutely can have explosions. And basically, all you need is something generating pressure and gas inside a closed container until you exceed the strength of that container. So, classic example would be Apollo 13. They had an oxygen tank that they were had a little fan inside that would stir up this kind of slushy, frozen oxygen, not quite liquid, not quite solid,
Mm,
but they would just keep it stirred up through the mission. And that one of those fans ended up with a short in it, and it caused an explosion in the spacecraft that ruptured that tank, damaged a lot of the surrounding equipment. Um, so, yes, you can have explosions. What I don't think you would have would be maybe the big sustained fireballs that we see sometimes. So yeah, you can absolutely blow it up. Occasionally, even spacecraft they used to have problems if they didn't properly vent things like fuel tanks at the end of a spacecraft life. If that tank had leftover propellant in it, now that it's okay, the spacecraft's defunct, it's maybe tumbling, so you're not controlling what part of it gets sun or not, and the thermal cycling can actually cause propellants in a tank to rupture. And there were several spacecraft that were tracking one rocket body, and then all of a sudden we're tracking thousands of pieces because the thing blew up on orbit.
mm,
Um, and that's a very real thing. So they learned, all right, we need to make sure we specially do things like vent the fuel tanks, safe the batteries so that they don't explode. Yeah, so you can absolutely have explosions. Like I say, I don't know that you'd get the big fireball and the kind of the classic trope of here's the burning Hulk, flames just drifting through the cosmos. You kind of have to have a source of oxygen if you're going to sustain that flame. So, yeah,
mm.
that's going to be a little challenging. Um,
Yeah, I had heard that that was not possible because of the lack of oxygen. You need that for fire. So an explosion would
mhm.
look like a ship just breaking apart. Would there be noise, or would you also
You
need that atmosphere for sound to travel?
Yes, so certainly, let's say you were in a large craft, the star destroyers. and there's an explosion somewhere else in the spacecraft, in the ship, sure, you would hear that explosion. You've got the air in the ship, you've got the metal to conduct the sound waves. So an explosion in another part of your craft, you would absolutely be able to hear. One ship over, you're flying in formation, you wouldn't hear a thing,
Hmm.
because the vacuum of space just doesn't have enough material in it to propagate those sound waves. And so you would see it. You would see it fragment. You might see an expanding, a brief flash of flame, fire, something, but it would be utterly silent from your perspective,
Hmm.
from any distance away.
Okay. Okay. I thought that in, kind of to finish off the Star Wars references, in Last Jedi, I thought that that one shot was pretty cool when you had the silent explosion in space. It's like the only one in the entire series, but I thought, "Huh, that's
Oh, where she
kind of
she jumped the cruiser through the
through
the
the other
Empire
ship."
fleet.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that was something that I recall people actually giving commendations to, just because, wow, they actually got it kind of right. Space battle, unless whatever noise you generate in your own ship, you'd hear that, but you just wouldn't hear anything else around.
Hmm. Okay, so kind of going back to your background in military, especially space related kinds of
Mhm.
things. So, can you explain the U.S. Space Force and kind of where it fits in within the military? What do they do? Do they have anything to do with NASA? Is that a separate entity? Can you just illuminate how that all kind of works for people who aren't aware?
Okay, and I will preface this by saying I got out of the Air Force before Space Force became a thing. So forgive me if I do have any inaccuracies. So I'll tell you what I think I know. So I was in when I was in the Air Force, I was in Air Force Space Command, and that was the branch of the United States Air Force that dealt with all the space stuff, launching stuff into space, operating it in space, tracking it, communicating to and from, basically everything that it took to get stuff to space and operate a mission there. Um, and the other services, Army and Navy, they also had small pockets of space forces. For instance, the Army, in particular, had some communication satellites. The Navy had some communication satellites that they would be the actual owner operators of.
Hmm.
The Air Force might put them in space. The Air Force might operate the spacecraft to kind of keep it in the right orbit, but the Army, for instance, would be the ones commanding the payloads to assign satellite frequencies for communication, things like that.
Hmm.
Um, and so along the way, one of the concerns was Air Force wasn't maybe funding the space mission as much as they could have, putting resources somewhere else. And so the decision was made, why don't we take all these space stuff and create a separate force? And so just like the Marine Corps is a separate service but falls under the Department of the Navy, Space Force was created as a separate service to provide all these space capabilities, utilities, and cats knocking things off the shelves behind me. Um, so Space Force was created to operate all things space, and it became a separate service under Department of the Air Force. So very similar in terms of that construct to the Marine Corps with respect to the Navy. Um, and then, yeah, they still basically do the same missions. They launch the satellites into orbit. They operate the satellites on orbit. They track everything that's up there. They provide communications and navigation and missile warning, reconnaissance and surveillance. All of those things that you would do in and from and through space are now done by the U.S. Space Force.
Hmm.
Um, and so all of that is pretty much aimed at the military customer. NASA is a very different beast. They're a civilian organization. Their focus is more research, development, exploration.
Hmm.
So historically, NASA has done things like, all right, we know this isn't commercially viable research yet. Nobody's going to make a lot of money on it. So NASA will conduct the basic research. And then as things mature, commercial entities can take the research that's been done, leverage it, build on it, and eventually turn it into a commercial product. So they do a lot of that with aerospace materials. Um, let's see, they also do exploration. So they build probes that are designed simply for pure science to go out, explore the planets, explore the solar system, explore outer, the extended universe as far out as we can see. Those are all missions of what NASA does. Um, where there's a little bit of overlap is in things like NASA has a branch that monitors what we call space weather. So the sun is constantly spewing out charged particles. It can have big eruptions called solar flares or coronal mass ejections. And the energy and particle from these events, when they hit the Earth or come in the near Earth environment, they can damage satellites. They can be hazardous to astronauts,
Hmm.
um, potentially even disrupt power grids on Earth, for instance, by affecting Earth's magnetic field.
Hmm.
So NASA has a vested interest in monitoring all this for a variety of reasons. Well, it turns out many of the same reasons NASA would monitor are things that the U.S. military would be interested in. So there are units in the Space Force that monitor space weather, and so there's a very common goal: what's going on. Um, Space Force would use a lot of data that the NASA guys would collect, and there's constant communication back and forth. So there's kind of a blend of shared interests there, and then also the Space Force, they operate some utilities that provide a worldwide service, GPS being the notable one. So GPS started out as a military navigation system, and that was what it was going to be. Let's be able to navigate anywhere in the world with high precision. Um, and then eventually people realized, well, these signals are beaming down from the sky. We can use this for civil purposes. And so people started using it, and pretty soon you have the turn-by-turn in-car navigation. But you also started discovering, GPS at its heart is a very precise clock. Um, and that's really what it all boils down to. The satellites are sending very precisely time tagged signals. Your receiver gets those signals, knows what time they were sent, knows what time it is now, and is able to calculate how long it took to get there. Using that travel time, the receiver is then able to calculate, I know the satellite was there, signal took this long to get here, do that for about 4 or 5 satellites. I can only be at this logical spot on or near the Earth. And so that's how it's figuring out by tracking the timing of the signals. Well, those super precise time signals are usable. We're using them right now. Our computer networks, power grids, pay at the pump, banking, anything that has to be synchronized at a very, very high level probably has a GPS time receiver, not because it needs to know exactly where that tower is, but the tower needs to know exactly what time it is to shift signals back and forth when you're doing time sharing on a very limited frequency so that our cell calls stay connected. Um, and all of that is driven by GPS.
Wow, that is pretty all encompassing. I didn't realize how much of, my daily life was kind of dependent on that that
Mhm.
technology.
And
I
that's
mean, I guess I
so that.
should have been. It's not like I'm unaware of satellites and
Mhm.
their role fully, but yeah, it's more far reaching than I had thought.
Absolutely, and it goes back to um, kind of that blend between what's military, what's civil.
Mhm.
GPS actually has signals that are usable by the anybody with an appropriate receiver. They're unencrypted. You just have to be able to download and understand what's in the signal. So that's used all over the place. There are military signals that only authorized military users have access to. They're encrypted. You have to have the appropriate decryption. Um, but one of the big challenges, and what I spent the latter several years of my career working on, were how do we bring on military side capabilities? How do we use the military side functions without impacting the civilian users?
Hmm.
because that was something that, way back in the day when GPS first came out, the there is a function built into it called selective availability, which would allow, at the time, the military to actually purposefully degrade the civilian signal so that the military had access to more precise navigation than the civilians did.
Hmm.
And basically, what they're trying to do is prevent anybody from having military grade targeting if you're trying to fly a weapon, for instance. Um,
Hmm.
and so, if you're doing turn by turn navigation, or hey, I'm out hiking in the mountains, if you know where you are to within 100 feet, you're probably pretty good for that hiker. But that, plus or minus 100 feet wasn't good enough for targeting. And then as GPS became more and more used, the government, I believe it was President Clinton at the time, actually signed a policy letter. The U.S. will not degrade the civilian signal,
Hmm.
and they took out that degradation because it had become so deeply embedded in the rest of commerce that we couldn't degrade it without massively affecting too many other people.
Hmm.
And so they just said, "Yep, we're not going to do that anymore."
That's interesting. All these ideas for what the ramifications could be are coming to mind that could make
Hmm.
for some pretty interesting stories. But I wanted to cycle back to something that you said earlier, that I
Sure,
had not really given much thought about, and that was space weather affecting astronauts, potentially affecting Earth, potentially solar flares, and so on. So what is it exactly that would affect the astronauts, the the Earth
sure.
in some way? It's the way you talked about it, it was more than heat, but I could have gotten that wrong. Is it actual particles that
Absolutely.
have those negative effects?
Yeah, so like I say, the sun is constantly pushing out waves of particles called the solar wind. And it's just kind of the steady day-to-day outflow of material from the sun, carried away by the radiation pressure of everything behind it. And so the solar wind is just sort of the day-to-day. It's kind of like we've got just, the breeze blowing around you on Earth, um, and it happens. Now, when the sun gets active and it goes through cycles of 11 years of high and low activity, we're coming into a peak right now. So in the next year, we should be around the maximum for the current cycle.
Mm.
In these cycles, you get more and more sunspots that are more tangled up. The magnetic fields store more and more energy in them, and when they rupture, you get a solar flare. Just a few days ago, there were twin X class flares. So you have a C, M, and X as the kind of the letter codes they assign, getting progressively more energetic. Anytime you get an X class flare, those are the big ones. And those can spew out charged particles, X ray radiation, things like that. And that flies through space. And eventually, if it's aimed and it hits the Earth, let's say you've got an astronaut in a spacecraft, that blast of charged particles is ionizing radiation and very bad for the human body if you're caught out in that blast as it goes by. Um, Back in the Apollo program, they had two space missions going to the moon. One had just come home, the other was getting ready to launch, and right in between, a massive solar flare happened. And they figured that had that flare been a few months earlier or later and happened during one of the missions, it quite possibly would have killed the astronauts. They would have gotten such a high radiation dose, it would have killed them
Oh,
on their
wow.
trip to or from the moon. Yeah, so this is definitely stuff that we want to monitor.
Is it
Um,
predictable at all? Like, Earth
in the sense
weather
that
to a certain extent, or
a little bit, we might at least have some forewarning.
okay.
So, for instance, NASA and other agencies, they operate a fleet of spacecraft and telescopes on the ground that are constantly monitoring the sun, especially looking for sunspots. And what they're looking for are spots that are very complex. They can tell the magnetic fields are really wound up tight. And you imagine it's like a rubber band. If you have a skinny little wimpy rubber band, you can wind it, okay, no big deal. Take a bundle of rubber bands, wind them up, and eventually you wind them tight enough, they snap. And you imagine that snap rubber band hitting your fingers like, ouch, that hurts. Well, the more magnetic energy that you get wound up and eventually snapping, the more energy you can release. So we can see the big sunspots. There's one out there right now. It's just past the midpoint and about to orbit around to the backside or rotate around to the backside of the sun again. Um, but yeah, that one's put out a couple of big flares recently.
Hmm.
Um, and so all this stuff comes towards the Earth. If you're close in, the magnetic field of the Earth will deflect a chunk of it. So that's kind of our force field. Stuff comes in, hits the magnetic field, is channeled around, and goes on by. So we're somewhat protected by that. Now that's only somewhat. You get a big enough blast, and it can punch through that. The other thing that happens is the Earth's magnetic field kind of emerges out of the North Pole, comes around, re enters at the South Pole. And imagine you've got almost like these funnels of the magnetic field. So the particles hit it and they get funneled up and then down to the North Pole or down into the South Pole. And when those particles hit the atmosphere, oh, that's where we get the aurora. And so you may see in the media they'll talk about, hey, there's a chance for aurora. It's because there was probably a flare or a coronal mass ejection that's pumped an extra blast of particles that are now predicted to hit the Earth at a certain time, get funneled into the polar regions, and create a bigger auroral display. Um, so so you can, like I say, if you're out in space and the radiation hits you, that can be bad. So for astronauts on the ISS, pretty much the only thing they could do is go to the most interior, the most shielded part of the spacecraft that you could get into, and hope that the magnetic field of the Earth and the hull of the spacecraft can block enough of the radiation that it doesn't make you sick. Um, and that's a real concern as we think about sending astronauts back to the moon, out to Mars. You get outside the Earth's magnetic field, you've just lost that built-in force field, and you're now exposed to the full force of whatever these blasts might be. Um, and so, yeah, that is an issue. Um, on Earth, one of the things that can happen is you get a coronal mass ejection, which moves slower than the flares, but it's think of it as more like a big wave on the ocean. The solar wind is just kind of the constant little ripples. A CME is like, oh, this big breaker just suddenly came in and whoop, dumps a lot of stuff on you all at once.
Hmm.
Well, when that hits the Earth's magnetic field, not only does it get funneled, but moving charged particles can actually push the magnetic field lines and get them waving back and forth. And so down here at ground level, if you could see them, the magnetic field lines would be waving back and forth. Well, Earth is blanketed by lots of big, long metallic things, power lines, communication lines, pipelines. Anything that's long and metallic with a magnetic field moving past it has just turned into a generator. And so you can generate power currents in these big grids that maybe you don't want. And they start surging one direction or another, and you start doing things like burning out transformers, and suddenly Quebec is in the dark because you took out their power grid in 1989.
Hmm.
In 1859, one of these big mass ejections hit the Earth. It was called the Carrington event after the scientist who actually observed it. He was looking through, making sketches of the sunspot at a telescope and saw the flare happen. And then a couple of days later, the ejection hit the Earth. The currents that it induced in that day, the state of the art was telegraphs. So you got these telegraph lines all over the place. These waving magnetic fields actually generated enough power in these lines. It was causing sparks and fires in telegraph stations.
Hmm.
And the operators would actually disconnect their batteries, and using only the natural electricity that was being induced in their lines, they were sending messages.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah. So there are suggestions that if an event that size hit the Earth today, So here's your lead in for a great storyline. If an event that size hit the Earth today, we might be talking years to fully restore the power grid into the more remote parts of the country
Oh, wow.
because it
It
would burn out so many transformers. We don't have them in stock. And so you get into the catch 22. I've blown the national power grid potentially. I don't have the transformers in stock to replace all the blown transformers. I need to make them. Well, in order to make the transformers, I need factories that don't have the power to
mm,
run. And so you can see where this becomes an issue.
right, it could go, like, state of emergency, now only the factories get them, and it becomes this whole kind of horrifying
All sorts of things. So
scenario.
this is why NASA very actively monitors the sun to
Hmm,
be on the lookout for things like this. If they saw a CME, coronal mass ejection, coming in that they said, yep, this is going to wallop us, one of the things they could do is tell power grid operators, hey guys, it's going to hurt, but you need to, for the next so many hours, turn off your grid, isolate the sections,
hmm,
and deliberately cause short lived blackouts to protect your equipment so that you don't burn it out and cause a years long blackout.
hmm.
And that is one of the things that could potentially happen.
I'm glad that there's the ability to foresee that kind of thing. 1859 was a big year scientifically. The Origin of the Species came out that year. Tale of Two Cities came out that year. Not scientific, but that's how I know. Okay, so you as you were giving me that explanation, you mentioned the ISS, like what people would do
Mhm,
in the event of one of these negative space weather patterns, I guess you could say. In the event of that emergency, they would just get into the most protected area
mhm.
of the station. Um, and I wanted to know a little bit more if you have the information, what kind of emergency protocols the ISS has for things like, getting hit with space debris or, extraterrestrial events or anything. Obviously, those are very different kinds of
Yes.
emergencies, but what can you tell us about what some of the first steps might be, or yeah, what you know about emergency protocols on the
Okay.
ISS?
So I'll start off by saying, with regards to alien whatever, no clue. And I'm
And
not
it's not the
sure,
focus of this. I know I could go off on just an endless tangent because I'm
um,
fascinated, but I wanted
yeah,
to
so
keep
I
this
can't really talk
more.
to that. But in terms of more, concrete real world emergencies, um, couple of probably the biggest ones that might be of concern would be a fire on board or a rupture in the spacecraft, space debris, something causes a hole. And so let's start with in all these cases, NASA, the Russian Space Agency, anybody who's going to put people into space like that, they have people who spend their pretty much, their job is to think about what can go wrong and what do we do about it. So they are, they're trying to figure out where are all the failure modes, how would we fix it, what are the backups,
Mm,
what would be the emergency plan, and yeah, so there's going to be a procedure for everything they can think of. Somebody's at least thought about if this happens, do A, B, and C. Um, when the Mir space station was up, they had, I recall, one very bad fire. Uh, Equipment short circuit, something happened, and they actually had a fire inside the spacecraft. And it was bad. It was to the point where they were almost going to have to abandon it if they couldn't get the fire under control. They have small fire extinguishers, so they were using those. They have respirator masks to give them at least clean air while they're in these areas with all the fumes.
right, everything's
And
enclosed.
yeah, exactly. So, you think about if a fire starts, think about all the wiring and the insulation and everything that's going to burn. It's going to generate all sorts of noxious fumes. They
And it
don't
would be
have anywhere to go.
consuming the oxygen, correct? Like
And yeah, yes. I
yeah.
mean, they probably had enough oxygen, so that wouldn't have been the issue. But things like the buildup of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, whatever other noxious chemicals are coming off this burning stuff, those would kill you long before you ran out of oxygen, probably.
Okay. That makes sense.
So anyway, the astronauts they had to get their breather masks, they had to get the fire extinguishers, and they eventually got it under control, put the fire out, were able to get the air scrubbers to clean up the air enough, and then continue on operation of the station. But it was close, and they were okay. At what point do we get in the escape capsule and abandon ship? And they always keep a spacecraft docked, um, to the Mir when it was up, and to the ISS as a lifeboat. If that happens,
Hmm.
you've at least got someplace to bail out to and then come back to Earth. Um, in the case of a collision, that is something that there you've really got kind of a couple of different ways to look at it. Anything that's big enough to be a truly catastrophic collision, we track pretty regularly. That was actually one of my jobs when I was on active duty, was tracking. I was in the squadron that we tracked everything man-made in orbit that we could.
Hmm.
And at the time, it was like 15,000 pieces or something that we were tracking on a regular basis.
What was
It's
the
now
sorry
So that
to
could be anything from a rocket body that put up a satellite, to an active satellite, to a dead satellite, to pieces of debris. Anything man-made in orbit, um, our job was to track it,
how
and we
large
could do
would the
that.
piece of debris have to be for you to register it on your tracking
We could
devices?
regularly track, something about the size of the computer mouse in low Earth orbit.
Okay.
Um, so we could do that. Um, And something like that hitting a spacecraft, that would be in the catastrophic level. So there were crew who their sole job was to look at everything in the catalog, all the orbits that we knew of, and run predictions. Okay, as the Mir or the shuttle or the ISS, as it's going through space, is anything going to cross it? If so, how far away? What's the miss distance? And then depending on that calculation, they had a couple of options. They could, if it had enough time and they had a clear space they could maneuver to, they would actually fire thrusters on the station or the spacecraft, change its orbit slightly to increase the separation as the two objects went past each other. So that was the preferred. Um, the second option was, all right, we know something is going to come close. We're pretty confident that space is big, the object is small, very low probability of actually hitting. So we're just going to wait this one out. And it may be we discovered it too late, or there's not a good place that we could maneuver to that wouldn't put them in danger of some new object.
Hmm.
And so it may be you just got to sit tight, and the probabilities are very, very low. And then you get the class where, okay, we can't maneuver, and this is going to come uncomfortably close. They would actually get into their escape capsule, and in some cases, they're ready to detach if something hits the station. Um, and so those were kind of levels. When I was on crew, one of my crewmates on a different shift, he found a piece of debris that hadn't been previously tracked
Hmm.
and got good elements, orbital elements on it. Sure enough, yep, this is a real object. We're tracking it regularly now. And a few hours later, he got word that the people monitoring these collisions for the Mir station had sent the data from this piece of debris he had found to NASA and the Russians, and they were hunkering down in the escape capsule of the Mir because the pass was going to be that close, and they couldn't maneuver away from it. And that was just because
Oh.
he found a piece of debris that hadn't been previously tracked,
Hmm.
which is kind of a cool bullet to get on your annual performance report.
No, no doubt. So if you got into the escape capsule,
Mhm.
um, is it fueled up and, with all the capabilities of actually making a landing and not just going into this kind of perpetual orbit?
Yes.
Because I've heard that it takes a lot of, I'm no expert, and that's why I'm talking to you, but that it takes a lot of energy to re-enter the atmosphere and to withstand all of that and actually
Mhm.
get people safe on Earth. And it doesn't take half as much energy to just kind of continue on an orbital path. So,
Right. So yeah, what they would do is the escape capsule is like a Soyuz spacecraft, the same kind that they would maybe like the Russians would launch astronauts to the station with. When they get up there, they leave it docked to the station, and typically at the end of a cruise rotation, they might take that one back down to Earth. And I don't know if they like always rotate the capsule or if it stays docked and they just go back in whatever most recently launched. But it is a fully functioning spacecraft, able to re-enter the astronauts, just like they would if they were doing a regular crew changeover. So they have that available to them. That yes, if they had to escape, they now have a path to get back to Earth,
Hmm.
um, and so that's how they would do that. Um, but yeah, you're hoping you would never need that. If you had a small piece of debris, something the size of a BB, that could still punch a hole clean through the station, if it's coming at you from the right direction. Because, and this is, you go back to the early question about what are your gripes. The movie, I think it was Gravity, where they have something hits the ISS.
That lives in
Um,
my mind. I was so traumatized by everything happening. It was so
things
stressful.
are moving so fast in space that unless you're in almost essentially parallel tracks, you would never see it coming. So if you're in any sort of a crossing trajectory and these pieces are coming at you, you're moving 17,500 miles an hour in your direction. They're coming at you in a crossing speed at 17,500 miles an hour. Um, how many miles per second? You're way faster than the rifle bullet. The thing would be there and gone before you even knew it had passed.
Whoa.
You wouldn't be able to follow it. So yeah, something like a BB at orbital speeds could potentially punch through significant layers of the station walls. Um, Something the size of a marble would probably go clean on through. Um, if that happens, it's not going to destroy the entire station, but it is going to create a hole. And so there, your most logical thing would be, all right, it's going to take some amount of time for the air to leak out through that hole. So you would be able to get out of the module through a door, seal the door, and basically your initial action would be, we're just going to seal off that section of the station, and then they'll figure out, okay, how do we deal with it? Because at some point it's going to lose all its pressure. What do we do? Is there a way to fix it? Do we have to jettison that module, or is it just that's the end of that section?
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know what the answer to that would be, but I'm sure somebody at NASA has some pretty detailed plans for what they would do.
I mean, I would assume, I would hope so, but you never can be sure. So speaking of astronauts, for those who are not just utterly terrified already by the things that you've said, characters that are astronauts. Is it possible for like what are the qualifications to become an astronaut? Like, could I, I'm in my 30s, I have a humanitarian background. Like, what kinds of things would I have to do, or would it even be possible for me to get to a place where I could be considered as an astronaut?
Mhm. Um, so
Or did I
yeah,
say
surprisingly,
humanitarian I think I said
the
humanitarian.
pool that anybody could be an astronaut is actually pretty wide. The things that I have in talking to people that I've met that are actual astronauts, at seminars or whatever, generally it seems to come down to things like you're in really good physical shape, so physically fit and active. You don't have any major diseases, no heart disease, no musculoskeletal, things like that. Generally decent eyesight. So you're, physically, they have whatever requirements, but generally you're in really good physical shape. Two, you're probably pretty stable mentally. Again, no major conditions that would require treatment. And for obvious reasons, it can be stressful if you get into an unknown situation. You need people that can be cool and level-headed, responding to that stress. All right, let's deal with it, move on, and not just freak out.
Mm,
Um, so, assuming you can pass that, then the next piece would be, what are your skill sets? What are you bringing as an astronaut? And most of the astronauts so far seem to be pretty heavily skewed into the STEM fields. Engineers,
understandably so.
scientists, in a particular field, um, things like that. And largely that's because if you look at the missions that we send astronauts to go do, Well, you're either working on very technical equipment, you're doing experiments, you're doing exploration. Having a technical background will allow you to operate equipment, troubleshoot equipment, conduct complex experiments under controlled settings, all these kinds of things. Um, and then you never know, okay, well, you've got a background in electronics. If something goes spung, you might be the person to have to dig into, all right, well, how do we reroute power and MacGyver some solution?
Mm,
And so having those kind of technical backgrounds could be useful. Go back to The Martian. You know, you've got to have structural science to how do I build and maintain a habitat? How do I get to have biology? How do I grow food with what I've got available? And so you think about all the different skill sets that you might build into a crew. No one person has to have it, but you would probably design your crew with all these skill sets and probably a primary and a backup. So that,
mm,
you know, if you lose your primary botanist, all right, at least we've got somebody who knows how to keep that plant alive. Um, so from that standpoint, you know, as long as you're physically fit and healthy, go get a field that would be useful. You don't have to go to the elite schools. You know, a good solid education. It's more about what have you done with your skill set than, oh, you've got a particular set of letters or school name behind your degree. Um, so yeah, it's really more what you can show you've done with it. A sense of curiosity, you know, that is first and foremost. Why do we send people out there? We're exploring. Um, you know, that one of the most compelling arguments for going to Mars is, aside from just the it was there, so we went and we climbed it. You know, why do people climb Everest? It was a challenge. So once you get past that, what's the real practical reason? Imagine you're looking for fossils, which is of course what they're doing up on Mars, trying to find evidence of life. You have to program the rover to know what rock to look at and how to look at it and what picture to take and where to aim its camera and where to aim its drill. And all of that has to be done and sent up, and then the rover goes and execute it. Meanwhile, the human strolling around on the surface looks around, ooh, hey, that's a cool rock, and leans over and picks it up purely on intuition. And you know, you can't build, at least not currently, that level of flexibility and intuition into our current rovers. Um, you know, so that's why you might send people. Now, it does carry a bit of a price tag and a logistics tail to it, which is why it's so ridiculously expensive. Um, but yes, there are actual some advantages. That ability to look at it and just on the spur of the moment, let me go around this hill. You know, it wasn't part of the mission plan, but just I got this gut feel. There's something over there that's cool.
mm.
Um, that's valuable, I think. And frankly, inspiration. We are not, as a species, sedentary. No matter where we've been, our populations have always expanded and moved on. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's just inherent in us. What's over the next hill? You know, what's on the other side of that mountain? What's on that planet? Let's go look.
Mm.
And it's a very deep, fundamental human thing, the urge to go explore like that.
I love that, and it's part of the reason why space is it's so fascinating because there is so much that is still being explored and understood and dug into, and there's so much of it that there's really no chance of getting to the
True.
end. So for any writers out there who
Mhm.
are planning on writing some hard sci-fi or things like that, what are some parting words of advice that you would give to somebody who wants to do a good job and write a compelling, true to life space story?
I would say, you know, first and foremost, don't be afraid of inventing you know, or invoking unobtainium or some, you know, some weird technology that doesn't exist, and we have to accept that there's going to be this great leap that doesn't exist today, but somebody's invented something new and it's there.
Hmm.
So you can totally do that and make a compelling story, but you have to get the basics right. And that's just it. If you can't, if you have somebody who's going, yeah, that wouldn't work on a just a basic element, aerodynamics, astrodynamics, something like that. Get the fundamentals right, because if you don't, it's hard to buy into the new technology, the new whatever. But if you get those basics right, then we'll happily go along for the ride.
Mm. Well,
And that is probably the biggest thing is, for whatever you're doing, go find somebody that can actually crunch some numbers for you if you need to. What would be the weight of that thing, the stress on it, the how much fuel would it take to make that maneuver?
mm.
How long could they breathe on however many kilograms of oxygen they have left in the tank? Yeah, go find people, do that kind of math, and if you can do those basics, then it sets the stage for your inspiration.
Well, thank you so much for providing all this expertise. Um, I know that I really appreciate your deep knowledge of all things space. And hopefully, the people who are watching this got something out of it as well, even if this is not a genre that you typically write. I know that I find it fascinating. So, again, thank you for being here with me today. Make sure to follow this channel, subscribe, like this video if you like it, and I'll see you next week.